Life on board a ship as a sailor in the past was hard enough, but imagine being a prisoner aboard one for months or years. The 18th and 19th centuries saw Britain fight numerous wars, and with civilian jails on land overcrowded with detainees, the government found an easy and cheap alternative by imprisoning convicts on old ships. They became widespread and could be found in ports throughout Britain, Australia, Gibraltar, and the Caribbean. The Royal Navy called these ships hulks, as they were either damaged vessels or ones that never saw completion. They could float, so they could still be put to use in harbours, but weren't seaworthy because their masts were removed. The first prison hulk, Tayloe, began use in 1775 and was moored at Barking Creek, just off the River Thames. She was desperately needed to accommodate convicts who had been bound for the Americas, but whose voyage was delayed by the American Revolutionary War. By the following year, all her inmates had been pardoned, enlisted, or died. Sentences of transportation to the Americas were soon done away with, and legislation passed to punish criminals with hard labour on the River Thames. With the government award of a contract for their accommodation, ships, including a frigate and an East Indiaman, were soon housing up to 510 convicts. Conditions were, initially, poor and mortality rates high. Being sentenced to serve time on a prison hulk wasn't a death sentence, but for some it might as well have been. Disease spread rapidly on board ships lacking quarantine facilities, as many inmates were already sick when they arrived from existing jails. Typhus, in particular, wiped out nearly a third of the prison ship population from 1776 to 1778. It's no wonder conditions allowed disease to run rampant. Inmates slept in narrow bunks, cramped one on top of another, and weekly food rations provided were inadequate for a grown man. Biscuits, pea soup, half an ox cheek once a week, porridge twice a week, and a lump of bread and cheese. A number of famous ships were decommissioned to become prison hulks following the Napoleonic Wars, including HMS Bellerophon, upon which Napoleon surrendered in July 1815, HMS Temeraire, which fought at the Battle of Trafalgar with HMS Bellerophon, and HMS Discovery, the lead ship in George Vancouver's exploration of the west coast of North America. Ships of the line were particularly suitable for conversion to prison hulks because of their large size and ability to crew hundreds of men. Parliament had intended the use of hulks to be a temporary measure to solve a shortage of prison accommodation in the face of a series of wars. However, the legislation that authorised their use was continually renewed until 1857, even allowing for more atrocious and daring offenders to be imprisoned on them. With the coming of convict transportation to Australia and other penal colonies alongside Victorian prison building, the need for hulks to house prisoners diminished, and they were slowly sold off, mostly between the 1830s and 1870s, and broken up for scrap, though some endured for longer as hospital ships. In later years, improvements were made to quarantine measures and food rations, but a man sentenced to a prison hulk still faced a miserable existence. Your chances of beating sickness and surviving depended much on where you ended up on the ship. The upper deck was dry and the ventilation good, but those condemned to the lower deck faced damp, small ports, and poor ventilation. This is where bad characters and the disgraced spent their days, with the sick and invalids on the middle deck, whilst those whose conduct was good and sentenced short could, in time, be raised to the upper deck. In the 1860s, Henry Mayhew, a Victorian journalist, documented the workings of the criminal prisons of London. He visited the prisons to investigate prison life for himself and interviewed officers and wardens. Today, you will hear Mayhew's account of life on the prison hulk Defence, which was moored at Woolwich on the River Thames. She was a third-rate ship of the line of the Royal Navy, in service from 1815 until converted to a prison ship in 1849. Mayhew's visit, in the morning, before breakfast, must have taken place before the 14th of July, 1857, which is the date on which she was badly damaged by accidental fire and scuttled. You will find out how strict and regimented the life of a prisoner was, from a 5:30 a.m. wake-up Roll calls, cleaning, hard labour, and doing everything in accordance with the command of an officer. There was no sitting in rooms playing games. Prison hulks were run like a military operation, and convicts were expected to fall in line. Bad behaviour was rewarded by a punishment diet and the threat of being condemned to the lower decks. You will discover that prison life on a hulk was hard and regimented. The only rest a convict received was either in sleep or in death. Before we move on, if you're interested in history like this, and you want to find out more about what life was really like for people in the past, please consider subscribing for more content. If you'd like to support what we make for you, check out the description for links to ways you can help us to continue bringing the past alive. The cold, grey light of early morning gave to everything its most chilly aspect when at 5 a.m. we stepped aboard the Defence, the old 74-gun ship, with the determination of spending an entire day with her 500 and odd inmates. As we run up the gangway of the silent hull and survey the broad decks and massive galleys and hammock houses in the misty light, the only sounds heard are the gurgling of the tide streaming past the sides of the black-looking vessel, and the pacing of the solitary warder guard. The silence and the stillness of the scene, in no way realizing the preconceived idea of a convict hulk. Yet as we pass to the ship's galley, at the forepart of the vessel, and see the copper sheathing glistening on the floor round the cook's fire, with a large black boiler above it, and the sparkling yellow fire shining through the broad bars, the sight reminds us that there are hundreds of mouths to feed below. The cook sharply rakes the burning coals, and the copper frets and spurts and steams with its unquiet boiling volume of the reddish-brown cocoa. This cook is the first convict with whom we have come in contact. He is preparing the breakfasts of his fellow prisoners, who are still sleeping under the hatches. Close at hand is the bread room, piled with baskets and boxes, while opposite is the officer's galley, with another stove standing on its plate of glistening copper sheathing. Above, on the forecastle, are the hammock houses, divided off into large, black, deep cupboards, bulging over the gunwale of the ship. Then we pass the drying houses for linen, used in wet weather, and the little cabins at the gunwale waist, where the mechanic convicts employed on board ply their respective handicrafts. Glancing overhead, we observe the shirts and stockings of the prisoners below, dangling from the scanty rigging between the masts and fluttering in the wind. We are now near the top-deck hatchway by the forecastle. It is still barred and padlocked. Here, the bayonet of the sentry on duty, glistening in the light, attracts our attention. Then we notice the heavy bright bell, swung in front of the hatchway. All is quiet yet. We can hear the water splashing amid the boats at the broad gangway, or along the shelving sides of the ship, under her barred portholes. The warder who accompanies us, ourselves, and the sentry are still the only people on the spacious decks of the old 74. The poop, given up to the governor's rooms and to those of his deputy and officers, is railed round, while a series of chimney funnels, projecting here and there, break the regularity of the outline. On reaching the top deck, we found it divided by strong iron rails, very like those in the zoological gardens which protect visitors from the fury of the wild beasts. From one end to the other, into long cages as it were, with a passage between them. In this passage a warder was pacing to and fro, commanding a view of the men, who were slung up in hammocks, fastened in 2 rows. In each cage or compartment of the ship there was also a little transverse passage at the end of each ward that allowed the officer on duty to take a side view of the sleepers and to cast the light of his bull's eye under the hammocks to assure himself that the men were quiet in their beds. The glimmering little lanterns attached to the railings, so that the warder on duty could trim them without entering the wards, were still alight. The glazed hats of the men hung up overhead, reflecting the pale beams, and the men themselves were still snoring in their dingy hammocks. In these 2 compartments, or wards, were 105 convicts, parted off into sections, and a curious sight it was to look upon the great sleeping mass of beings within them. The hammocks were slung so close to one another that they formed a perfect floor of beds on either side of the vessel, seeming like rows of canvas boats. But 1 or 2 of the prisoners turned on their sides as we passed along the deck, and we could not help speculating, as we went, upon the nature of the felon dreams of those we heard snoring and half moaning about us. How many, thought we, are with their friends once more, enjoying an ideal liberty? How many are enacting or planning some brutal robbery? How many suffering, in imagination, the last penalty of their crimes? How many weeping on their mother's breast, and promising to abandon their evil courses forever? And to how many was sleep an utter blank, a blessed annihilation for a while to their lifelong miseries? The convicts here arranged were first-class men, there being manifest advantages in the top deck over the middle and lower ones. We followed the warder towards the stern of the ship, and at the extremity of this deck we crossed a grating and reached the hatchway leading to the middle deck. The middle deck was arranged on the same plan as that of the top one, excepting that the passage between the swinging hammocks was wider. Here 129 men were sleeping in divisions or wards. Here, too, the officer was parading between the wards or cages, and splashing about chloride of lime that stood in buckets between the wards. It was still very dark, and the groaning, coughing, and yawning of the sleeping and waking prisoners had anything but a cheerful effect on the mind. The air was close and unpleasant, but not remarkably so, considering it had been exhausted by the breath of so many men since 9 o'clock on the previous night, when they turned in. We had still another deck to visit, so we followed our warder and ascended the hatchway to the lower deck, which was higher and had a broader passage than the 2 upper ones through which we had just passed. This deck was arranged to accommodate only 240 men, but at the time of our visit it contained only 190 sleepers, arranged in sections. This spacious deck stretches right under the forepart of the poop, the barred portholes admitting but little light. Still, the air is fresher than in the decks above, which receive the ascending heat from the 190 sleepers, for, by means of broad openings in the stern and bows of the ship, a constant stream of fresh air is carried through the vessel. Altogether, there were, at the time of our visit, 424 convicts stowed between the decks. The men seem to be comfortably covered, having 2 blankets and a rug each. The tables used for meals are unshipped and lean against the bars of the passage. The men's boots are under their hammocks, and their clothes lie upon the benches. Having passed through this gloomy scene, we reached a narrow whitewashed passage at the head of the lower deck, and entering by a side door, we come to the solitary cells. We follow the bull's-eye carried by the warder. Presently he stops, and placing his lantern against a rude opening in the bulkhead, throws its light upon a man in one of the cells within, who is sentenced to 48 hours. Having inspected the sleeper, who is lying from our view, so we advance across immense whitewashed timbers, or knees, that stand up as solid as milestones, and so on to the opposite cell in the bows. This one is empty, but the next contains a prisoner who is in for 3 days, on bread and water, for refusing to work in the boats. We then return to the lower deck, through a door at the opposite side to that at which we entered the solitary cell passage. There are 5 such cells in all, 2 on either side, and 1 in the bows. As we re-entered the lower deck, we found the lampman, a convict, in a grey Scotch cap, blowing out the lamps. He, together with the cooks and officer servants, are let out a little before the general call time, their services being necessary before the prisoners are roused at 5:30 o'clock, and the day's business begins. The deep-toned bell against the forecastle now sounded 3 bells. The men had been expecting the unwelcome sound, for a few minutes before, as we traversed the lower deck to examine the air passages and ventilators, we saw heads popped up here and there from the dingy hammocks to have a peep at us as we passed. The usual hour for rising was evidently at hand. The effect of the bell, however, was astonishing. In a minute, scores and scores of men tumbled out of their beds and were wriggling and stretching themselves in their blue shirts. "All up! Turn out, men!" cries the officer, and the convicts are in their trousers in an inconceivably short time. "Let us go to the top deck, and we shall see how the hammocks are lashed," suggests our warder, and on ascending to the upper decks, we find many of the men already dressed, and with their hammocks lashed up like huge sausages. Presently the gates were opened, and the men turned out one after another, carrying their bolster-like beds on their shoulders. "Now, men, go on there, steady, steady," exclaims the officer. "Come on, men, come on, the rest of you," he shouts as we reach the forecastle. The men appear in single file, some carrying one hammock and others 2. Those who carry 2 have, in addition to their own bed, that of a fellow prisoner who remains below to forward other work. Some of the men are fully dressed in their brown striped convict's suit, while others are in their blue shirt sleeves. The officers continue shouting to the men and hastening their movements. "Come on with that hammock. Come on now." Long lines of men, with their hammocks upon their shoulders, wind along the decks. The sides of the black hammock houses are open, discovering lettered compartments as A1, A2, B1, etc., and the warders on duty go into the houses and see the hammocks stowed as the prisoners deliver them under their proper letters, varying the work by directions as, "Shove that a bit forward there. Now then, stow away there, my lads. Stow away. Do you belong here? How came you so late? Any more, C1? Is that the last of C1? Now then, come on, lads, move up." "We get the whole ship up and stowed in half an hour," said our warder. "The bell went at 5:30, and you'll see, sir, we have all the hammocks up by 6. Still the line of men moved forward to the hammock houses, each hammock bearing the prisoner's registered number stitched upon it, and with the word "Defence" printed on the canvas. The prisoners continued to pour out as we descend again between the decks, and find that many have got the tables shipped against the bars, and the benches ranged beside them. Now some of the men are washing in buckets, placed ready overnight, and others arranging their hair by the reflection of the window pane, and others, again, scrubbing the tables ready for breakfast. Everything and everybody seemed to be undergoing a cleansing process, more or less searching. We next proceeded once more to the deck below, following our guide. The scene was a busy one. Some of the prisoners were still combing their hair, others were washing the deck boards, which were shining under the plentiful supply of water. Others, again, were covering the white deal tables, which are scrubbed also every morning, with painted canvas tablecloths. Then there were groups of men, down on one knee, brushing their boots, while the messmen were busy at the preparations for breakfast. The tables, ranged in a row along the wards, accommodate 8 prisoners each. Each man takes his turn as messman, while the service of the ward is divided. All the breakfast things are in block tin, and they glisten as though they had never been used. Some of the men have polished theirs overnight, and tied them up in their handkerchiefs, to give themselves a little extra time in the morning. "Where's your plates? Where's your plates?" cry the messmen. For water, one prisoner at a time is let out of each ward, and as soon as he returns another is allowed to go on deck. The various processes, collectively called getting up, may now be said to be complete, and the prisoners are all fairly padlocked in their wards, under the eye of a single warder. After 6 o'clock in the morning, however, there are 2 officers upon the lower deck till 9 o'clock in the evening, when the men turn in. The costume of the prisoners, as we now see them completely dressed, is the same as that worn at Pentonville, that is, rusty brown, with red stripes upon it. The chief warder enters and inquires whether all are up. All up is the answer, as the men give the military salute. There, you see, sir, said our attendant, as 4 bells, 6 o'clock, rang. All the hammocks are on deck and the men are locked up, as I said they would be. The first business of the morning being over, the men break into groups or read. Many a one, to our astonishment, took his Bible and began reading it with no little earnestness. Here an altercation ensued between 2 prisoners about the tins, which one of them was still cleaning. This was promptly suppressed by a cry of, "Halloa! What are you about there? Losing your temper?" At this time, too, the doctor's mate appeared, carrying a wooden tray covered with physic bottles and boxes of salve, and followed by an officer holding a paper containing the invalid list. This officer checks the distribution of the medicine. The ship now begins to wear an animated appearance, for at 6 o'clock the officers, chief warders, and cooks come on board, all those we had seen previously having been on duty throughout the night. We went down once more between decks. The muster of the prisoners had just commenced. 2 officers were occupied in the wards. The prisoners were all ranged behind the tables. "Silence! Keep silence there!" shouted an officer, and then, while one officer called the names of the prisoners, the other marked down the absentees upon a slate. As each name was called, the man owning it responded, "Yes, sir," accompanying his reply with a military salute. The replies of "Yes, sir," in every variety of voice, ran along the wards. This ceremony over, the registering officers retired, and the warder on duty padlocked the men in once more. We then went to see the muster of the absentees, as the cooks, bakers, and the like, which was carried out in the same way as with the prisoners in the wards. Only each absentee, as he cried "Yes, sir," and saluted, passed out to return to the duty from which he had been for the moment withdrawn. "There, you see, now, every man in the ship has answered his name," said our attendant. "All correct, sir," said the registering warder to the chief. "Now then, A ward," was shouted down the hatchway. "This is A ward, sir," said our attendant. "Coming up for breakfast." Instantly 4 of the convicts appeared following one another. "That's for A ward. Now, then, B ward here." "B ward," was next shouted down, and in this way the messmen of the various wards were summoned from their decks to fetch the breakfasts of their comrades, the messmen of each deck appearing at different hatchways, for it may be here observed that there is a separate hatchway for each floor of the vessel. The messmen were now seen moving along in file towards the ship's galley, and presently there reappeared, each man carrying a large beer can full of cocoa, the bread being taken down in baskets and served out by the officers at the ward doors. At 6:30 the doctor comes on board, when an officer goes round shouting in the wards, "Any men to see the doctor?" 6 men appear in answer, and are formed in line near the galley door. They are ushered one by one into the little surgery, and here, if the case is considered at all serious, a trap-door is opened, and they are passed at once down into a little separate room underneath, prepared with bath and other convenience. 9/10 of the calls for medical assistance, however, are dismissed as frivolous, such call being looked upon with great suspicion, as generally evincing a desire to avoid a day's labour in the arsenal. After breakfast the felons form work gangs and are landed ashore for hard physical labour, such as rolling munitions, breaking granite and moving timber. While remarking the 6 applicants for medical assistance, we also noticed 4 men drawn up in a line at the end of the main deck, attended by an officer. These were reported men, about to answer for some infraction of prison rules. We now followed the chief warder below to see the men at breakfast. "Are the messes all right?" he called out as he reached the wards. "Keep silence there, keep silence," shouted the officer on duty. The men were all ranged at their tables, with a tin can full of cocoa before them and a piece of dry bread beside them, the messmen having just poured out the cocoa from the huge tin vessel in which he received it from the cooks. and the men then proceed to eat their breakfast in silence, the munching of the dry bread by the hundreds of jaws being the only sound heard. After this we returned to where the reported prisoners were drawn up, facing the governor's house, upon the quarter-deck. They were called into the office one by one, and as the second man was called, the first reappeared, and was marched off between two officers to a solitary cell. "This is my report for yesterday. I give one in every morning," said the officer attending us, as we went to hand the document in, together with a cell report, stating the number of prisoners under punishment, the days they had done, etc. Next our attention was directed to the convict boatmen who were preparing to take the ship's messenger ashore, continued our persevering informant, to bring off the cook and chief warder. "They have already been on shore this morning. That's the hospital cutter, sir." And our friend pointed to a little boat, rowed by two prisoners in their brown suits, and carrying 3 or 4 warders in the stern. "Now, sir, our boat's just going aboard the Unit," for such is the general pronunciation of the French name. "Here is our sick report, sir, for the day. It is delivered in every morning. There are only 2 men on it now. One, you see, requires light labour, and the other low diet." He continued, showing us the document. At this moment a dashing little boat with her stem seats cushioned and rowed by 4 men, pulling long oars, appeared at the gangway. "This is the gig, sir, to take the doctor away." The officers now begin to exhibit great activity, while the men below are cleaning their tables and tins, having finished their morning's meal.